So I'm assessing Emma's work. I'm going to start by talking about your essay. So I thought there was a lot of strength in it. It was very conversational as well as formal, and the scheme of work aims work ahead and discussed. You had a really good balance of discussion between the academic and the vocational scheme of work, which I thought was great. There was no obvious favourite. It wasn't very clear to see which one you had written and which one you were analysing. You had a good constructed argument. I thought both were discussed in terms of their strengths and weaknesses rather than just telling the reader what they were doing. It was good in terms of argument. And you reflected back on your justifications in terms of your activities and your methods, which I thought was really good. One thing I did notice was there were a couple of generalisations. So you say an academic scheme of work, but it's not really clear whether you're referring to academic scheme of work in general or the one you're talking about. So maybe just make sure that you bring everything back to your point and your scheme of work that you're talking about at that time. Sometimes you would tend to make a comment but then it wouldn't have any justification in terms of wider reading or anything kind of external. So maybe again, just make sure a point never stands alone, it always has a kind of so what at the end, that you're always justifying your answers. Something I really thought was good was that in your critical comparison, everything was weighed up in comparison to each other. There wasn't a standalone point in terms of that, so everything you said you kind of compared to the other scheme of work, which I thought was great. You had good reference to wider reading and a good use of diagrams, which was really helpful to kind of see the theory in practice, and a good use of blooms. You really related that back to your scheme of work rather than just talking about blooms in general, which I thought was good. Just in terms of wider reading, there are a couple of referencing errors, just some small ones in terms of brackets and referencing a quote and things like that. So just make sure that you read through it and definitely check the Harvard system. In terms of your assessment methods, you did discuss the ones that you'd used, but I thought perhaps you could have used more wider reading related to assessment in terms of why didn't you use summative assessment, why did you stick to formative, rather than just backing up what you did do. Something that was really interesting is that I didn't pick out in your scheme of work the diagnostic assessment, but then you went and justified it in your essay. So perhaps you could make it clearer in your scheme of work that that part was diagnostic, because I didn't quite pick that up. So maybe to an outside reader, just make that a little bit clearer. You had a good discussion of the differences of individual learning in the academic and vocational schemes of work. However, sometimes there was a slight confusion over the term differentiation. I wasn't sure whether you meant it in terms of the differentiation in the classroom and the tasks they were doing, or in terms of the learning that was taking place. So maybe just clarify what type of differentiation you're talking about. But overall, it was a great essay, it flowed well and was easy to read. So your scheme of work, it's clear in terms of the context and the lesson objectives and was very detailed and precise. However, one thing I did notice, it covered 10 lessons, but there was potentially quite a lot of content, quite a few objectives per session. Obviously, I'm not quite sure how it would work in terms of time, but I got slightly confused on your side. It kind of had the sessions, but I wasn't sure which ones related to which, whether it was just an umbrella for all the sessions that were happening, or whether you were specifically relating, like Thursday this will happen, Friday this will happen. So maybe just make that a bit clearer for someone who's an outside reader. In your scheme of work, you consider differentiation, which was great, and you had a lot of stretch products for more developed learners in terms of making one-to-one sessions and things like that to develop their knowledge if they were more ahead. In terms of skills, you relate everything back very subject specific, which I thought was great. Even though you have a consideration of functional skills, everything kind of related back to the art element, which I thought was good. Sometimes the functional skills are just thrown in and don't have a point, and it was quite related, which I thought was very useful. In terms of the assessments you selected, it was obvious that they were relevant to the course and it was appropriate for that group of students. And you specifically said how they document their progress along the way, so it was clear they were tested and that it was formative rather than an exam at the end, which I thought was really relevant and clear that it was appropriate for them. One thing, you had a good balance of group work and individual learning. However, I thought there was a tendency for it to say students will do this individually, students will do this individually. So maybe there could be like a check-up on their learning or something like, or have a tutorial or a one-to-one or something like that. All the columns are relevant. I thought it was great that you had the stretch, push and challenge section as well, which was clear. I thought it was interesting that you didn't include a summative assessment in your scheme of work. and it was formative across the term. I thought maybe you could write either in your rationale or your essay why you chose to do that. Because for an outside person, you might think, how are you going to assess the scores at the end of the course or the end of the term? But yeah, everything related back to the objectives, and it was all relevant, and it was very clear and very instructional as well. Easy to lift a lesson plan from that scheme of work. In terms of your rationale, it discusses the vocational scheme of work and its requirements and the assessment methods you used. However, I thought you could relate it more to the actual assessments in the scheme of work rather than just assessment in general in terms of academic and vocational. You heavily talk about plumes, which was great. It was very clear how you related the taxonomy to your scheme of work. You critically present the reasons for the activities in your scheme of work. However, I thought you could potentially critique your scheme of work too, rather than just saying, I did this because. Maybe kind of say, this wasn't as successful, or kind of have a bit more evaluation. The rationale takes into account the individual needs of the learners, and you justify these, which is great. However, there wasn't a lot of detail in terms of the unit criteria, so I wasn't sure whether students were actually hitting this criteria by carrying out those lessons. So maybe just a couple of comments you could include about how it relates back to the whole general unit. You discussed the needs of the learners, and that's great. However, there was no mention of like an individual learning plan in terms of whether there's any students that have difficulties in certain areas or anything like that. So maybe you could relate this back kind of at the end in conclusion. Yeah, you had good reference to rider reading, and it was very interesting to read. I enjoyed it. So well done.